Let's speak now to our correspondent in Cairo, Bernard Smith. Bernard, we've been seeing pictures at the military base in Cairo where we understand those bodies of the 25 policemen who were killed in Sinai are being brought back to the capital. I mean, violence in the Sinai is nothing unusual, but the sheer number of security forces who were killed here does make it stand out, doesn't it?
Yes, this was an exceptionally large attack and quite an apparently well executed attack. We've seen violence uptick significantly in the Sinai Peninsula in the 4 weeks or in the time since the ousting of President Mohamed Morsi, and in the last week or so there has been a real notable increase in violence there. And on state television this evening and on other television channels, many of them carrying live pictures from the airport where the bodies of these police officers will be returned to, because the Egyptian government is keen to point out that they believe they are fighting terrorism here in Egypt, and this tragic, terrible incident in the Sinai highlights what the Egyptian government says it is facing.
Yeah, but we can see that on the strap on the Egyptian television screen in English, Egypt fighting terrorism. Are we likely to be seeing the government relating this incident in Sinai to the ongoing protests that are happening in Cairo and other cities around Egypt?
Well, what we can say is that in the last 24 hours, the Egyptian interim government has gone all out to portray the protests happening in this country as attempts to destabilise the country. Of course, those anti-coup protesters would say theirs is a political battle that they're taking. The interim government says no, they are trying to destabilise the country. There's been no direct connection by the government between these two incidents, but certainly the terrible events in Sinai fit the narrative that the Egyptian government is selling its people, and that is that there's an attempt to destabilise the country.
In the meantime, we're seeing these protests again filling the streets of cities around Egypt after curfew. What's happening there at the moment?
Yeah, there are a series of protests at various spots around the country. Not everywhere in Egypt is under curfew. About half of the country is, and a lot of the major population centres. There are a few going off in Cairo. They're not huge numbers of people at these protesters. This is a working, the working week has now started and people have to earn a living. So there's not as many out on the streets as you might see on a weekend. And also, we noticed last night that while in some places where protesters were continuing to protest during the first couple of hours of the curfew, they were allowed to disperse. There was no forcible intervention from the security forces there. However, a couple of hours into the curfew, and the army really does take control of the streets and the security forces. Nobody can move around at night here. Certainly in Cairo, there's a very strict enforcement of the curfew into the early hours of the morning.
And Bernard, just another development that I want to touch on before we let you go today. We're hearing that former President Hosni Mubarak, who of course was ousted back in 2011, might be released within 48 hours. Tell us about that and how likely this report is.
Well, that comes from Hosni Mubarak's lawyer, and as you might expect his lawyer to play up the chances of his client's imminent release. But the fact is, it looks extremely unlikely, because Hosni Mubarak still is facing very serious charges for failing to prevent the deaths of the protesters who were killed during the revolution that led to his ouster, and he's also facing a series of corruption charges as well. So as far as we understand it, he isn't likely to be released anytime soon, despite what his lawyer might hope.